So World Cup betting markets are absolutely huge, much bigger than you would see in the domestic football season and even bigger than the European competitions. They are the pinnacle of a player's career, and that's reflected in the markets. So in this video, we're going to explore the sort of betting and trading characteristics that you see at the World Cup, which will give you a much better chance of profiting from it. I've been successfully betting and trading for over 2 decades. If you want more videos like this and you want me to describe more of what I do, then give us a like. If you want to talk to like-minded people, visit the BetAngel forum where you can do exactly that, but also visit our website where you can download a free trial of BetAngel. So when I was recording this video, I was in two minds as to whether I should do it, because I've done these videos before and they're not that popular, because YouTube wants the shocking truth about the World Cup, or the amazing so-and-so strategy that will deliver blah, 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 with no effort, no risk, and so on. So 99% of people who actually want real information from somebody who actually does this will never see this video. So congratulations if you are watching this video. But what I'll present to you is how I approach it, because for every major sports event that I trade or bet on, I'm looking at all my archived data, everything that I've done in the past, to try and understand how it was different and what worked last time and where those little edges are, because generally speaking, the markets are pretty efficient. So you're just looking for a tiny edge somewhere to exploit that will allow you to deliver some profit over the course of this particular event. And when we look at things like the World Cup, they are important markets, because if we look at the World Cup final in 2018, it turned over just under £40 million. And the markets of the World Cup can be huge, and that means that you can do a lot of things that maybe you couldn't do in a normal football match. Because there's so much money around, it just opens up a whole world of opportunity for you. So World Cups are something that I do put a lot of focus into, and I'm looking forward to doing this particular World Cup. And one of the things that I'll throw in at the front end of this video as well is, if we're talking about liquidity and turnover, one of the curious things that you notice at the World Cup is that when you get an England match, liquidity goes up. Liquidity does vary across the tournament, because early on in the tournament it will be a bit lower and it gets bigger as the tournament goes on, but also televised match in the right time zone, and particularly with popular teams, see huge levels of liquidity. So there's your starter for 10. That's one of the things to look for. But let's go through and have a look at some of the key characteristics that I've learned over the last 20 years or so at the World Cup. So the first thing to note about the World Cup is it is a seeded tournament. It's the same in tennis and Grand Slams. And the concept of a seeded tournament is that all of the big opponents meet in the latter stages. Why? Because it's great for revenue and it's great for TV and all of those sort of things. You don't want them going out early. So tournaments that are seeded are effectively, for want of a better word, fixed. You want to see those teams get through to the later stages where they compete. So they seed all of the teams the same way that they seed players in a tennis tournament to make sure that they progress. So if you're looking to capture value on the outright winner market, it's very difficult to do that because you can't sort of dutch a selection of the outsiders, because most of them will not make it to the latter stages. They are going to meet a really strong team at some point, and that is going to be very hard for them to progress. However, you can capture some value by doing the opposite, because in the World Cup, the teams have to go from the group stages and they have to qualify into the knockout phase. And you can get quite low odds on the to qualify markets that you can oppose. In other words, you can go and lay at low odds, preferably to a fixed liability, as I've shown in previous videos. And you only need one of those to come off in order to pay for some of the bets that perhaps didn't come off. So go into some of the groups, into the individual groups, look at the teams there and lay them at very short odds. And one of those is very likely to pay off in this particular World Cup. As an example, in the last World Cup, the previous winners from 2014, Germany, went out in the group stages. They were priced at very, very short odds. And the interesting thing is, if you look at this from a trading perspective, you can get even shorter odds as the group stages start to progress. So Germany actually reached 101 to qualify in the group stages in the last World Cup and still failed to qualify for the knockout phase. And if we look at the World Cup before that, Spain did exactly the same thing. And it's a constant trend that we see throughout the World Cup, certainly in all of the years that I've been trading it, that to qualify markets tend to produce an opportunity to pick up a little bit of value. So it is possible to trade team news at the World Cup. The liquidity on individual matches is quite high, and it extends over a few days. Obviously, we know what the group stage games are going to be, and therefore if a player gets injured, that will likely affect the odds in the next match, and there will be plenty of liquidity for you to take advantage of that. I can give you some examples from prior World Cups, and if we look at 2018, we had this scenario where James or James, depending upon which way you want to pronounce it, Rodriguez was injured for Colombia, and as a consequence the price on Colombia started to drift in their next match against Japan. Now, as it looked less and less likely that he was going to play, the drift continued, and then basically when the team sheet announced, sure enough, he was not in it. So that was a big negative for Colombia. So yeah, team news can affect matches within the World Cup, and it's more likely to affect the next match that is up as opposed to anything that is happening immediately, because most teams are well known as we get to the actual day of the match itself. But the funny thing that happened in the last World Cup was we had Egypt in the World Cup. That wasn't the funny thing that happened. The funny thing that happened was that they were playing Saudi Arabia. They published their team sheet on Twitter, and everybody immediately noticed that Mo Salah was not in the team. So the price in the market absolutely flew out when it became obvious that Mo Salah was not playing. Now, he was carrying a knock, but everybody expected him to play anyway. And the funny thing was, he actually did, because he was in the team. It was a mistake. And the Egyptian FA basically came out and said, oops, sorry for that. Mo Salah actually is playing. Now, quite what went on there, we will never know. And probably the most famous situation similar to that was when Brazil played France. I think it was in 98. I may stand corrected on that, when Ronaldo didn't play. But this was a funny thing that happened in the World Cup in 2018. Mo Salah wasn't going to play, but then he did, or it was a mistake or something like that. But you can imagine the reaction that the market had to that particular news. So the top three things that you're looking for in a football match are goals, goals, and goals. You'll know from previous videos that I focus most of my attention not on some ethereal stat like they've won 3, or when Harry Kane is playing he does this or whatever. I'm really focused on trying to understand how many goals are likely to be scored in any particular match. Now, the problem with the World Cup is you're looking at teams from completely different disciplines, and therefore that is actually quite hard to work out. But we can infer some trends in terms of the way that the tournament progresses and how individual games are played that could help you nudge up or down that value depending upon what betting or trading strategy you have. Because when we look at the group stage, we're going to have 3 games, and that first game within the group stage tends to be a bit of a tense affair. Teams don't tend to go for it on that first match. They tend to be a little bit cagey. They tend to ease their way into the tournament, try and get a win and so on. But fundamentally, when you look at the statistics, it's quite interesting, because when we look at that first game in the group, it tends to contain fewer goals than the second or third. We tend to find it's sort of slight, and of course you have to vary it from one group to another, because you're going to get some really severe mismatches here. But fundamentally speaking, most teams don't want to lose that first game. That's the most important thing. And as a consequence, we're looking at an average of about 2.4 goals in those first group games that we see. And when we go to the second and third, then you tend to see slightly more goals. And again, we can describe exactly why that is, because once you know the result of the first match, you're going to know what you need to do in the second match. And when you've done the second match, you know exactly what you've got to do in that third match. So any betting or trading strategy that you have should take advantage of this characteristic by erring on the side of there being less goals in a slightly cagey game in that first match, and in that final match, subject to what is required, things will be completely different. So this is one of the key characteristics that you have through that particular stage of the tournament, is that you actually need to keep an eye on how those games are played and the incentive to score or the incentive not to concede. That is a very, very dominant characteristic at these particular tournaments that's very different from domestic football. And when we go into the knockout stages, that process is amplified dramatically because, of course, you're only 90 minutes away from total oblivion and humiliation on the flight home. So as a consequence, teams play much more cautiously in the knockout stages. They're much more careful about not conceding rather than overstretching themselves and scoring and leaving a few gaps at the back. So whatever betting or trading strategy you've got, you should definitely take that into account because the difference is very stark. The knockout stages score the fewest number of goals. The first round of group matches score the next fewest number of goals, and then it sort of rises from there. So yeah, make sure you take that into account when you're looking at any betting or trading strategy. So one of the important bits of work that I did in the 2018 World Cup was to compare that to prior World Cups. And you're thinking, well, don't you do that every World Cup? Well, yes, I do. But in 2018, we had the introduction of VAR. And I was really, really keen to see, I sort of had a feeling as to how it would influence things, but I was really keen to understand how it actually would affect things, because fundamentally, VAR interjects itself between the officials and the rules. And the problem with previous World Cups was that FIFA would pick delegates from many different federations, and the standard of refereeing varied quite a bit, shall we say. And VAR sort of cut through that. That actually sort of leveled the playing field a bit more, because fundamentally speaking, we're a neutral tournament, and therefore you would expect the outcome and the referee bias and the official bias to be a little bit different there. But we have seen in previous World Cups that that wasn't the case. But in 2018, we had a unique opportunity to measure that. And what we actually found was that there were fewer offsides, there were more penalties, and there were more goals from dead ball situations. So that sort of reinforced that view that, in fact, if you sort of take away a little bit of the bias and the subjective judgment of the officials, then that does influence the match, but generally sort of positively. So, of course, it will be in use again this time around, and that trend will probably be in place. But this has been one of the things that I've been looking at, is how that is used and how that is influencing the match. But that was one of the big differences that we saw in 2018 versus prior World Cups, and I would expect that to be the case again this year. So I've saved one of the key statistics till last, and that is, and you already know this if you've watched some of my other videos, that outsiders score more often than they should and win more often than they should at the World Cup. Now, you would have heard me say this sort of thing before, but it's important to understand why at a knockout tournament this is likely to occur. You've got a lot of teams that will be favoured and receiving heavy backing support. But also, the nature of these particular tournaments is that you can, get some glory through just 90 minutes worth of play. So teams that are outsiders will, know that they've got a decent shot at perhaps turning it over and having a significant impact on the outcome of their tournament if they are able to score or win a match. But also, when you look at these heavily favoured teams, if they're struggling to break down a well-organised opponent, then they may tend to get a little bit tetchy and nervous, or they may try and go for that, look for that winner, leave a little bit of space at the back, and that's where that particular shock can come from. But when I've looked at every single World Cup, this is something that has stood out for me, is that the outsiders tend to be value from a betting perspective. Now, if you're trading, the interesting thing is if you can find value within a market, that sort of amplifies the potential returns that you can get when you're actively trading. So if you're coming in and out of the market, you're able to do it more frequently for more money when you see this little gap in value appear. It's not absolutely huge, and you obviously need to get your staking right if you're trying to take advantage of this. But the propensity for sort of shock results or shock leads tends to be a little bit higher at a knockout competition, and more so at the World Cup. So yeah, this is one area that you should be looking at when you're looking at all of those matches that are likely to take place this year. So I know lots of people would love to have a low-risk strategy that will work at the World Cup 2022. But let's be realistic here. Most betting markets are generally efficient, and you probably know lots of different strategies that you may or may not want to use. So what I've tried to present for you in this video here is I analyse and look at all of the statistics that come out of these major tournaments, And I'm trying to see individual variations and try and understand why they exist, but also quantify them to some extent and understand how that all fits into the mix. And what I've tried to do in this video is give you some pointers as to where you're likely to find those little discrepancies within the market that may benefit or disadvantage you depending upon the strategy that you're trying to follow, whether it's an outright betting strategy or whether you're doing some sort of trading strategy within these particular markets. Hopefully I've been able to give you a hint as to where you can find those opportunities. But also bear in mind, there's only 64 matches within the World Cup. So if you suddenly go from normal stakes to humongous stakes, you may find that whatever strategy you've got may not play itself out over those 64 matches. When you're in the domestic football season, you've got 9 months for that to play out. So any edge that you've got will almost certainly work over that period of time. But when we've got a limited subset of matches, you may find that, it's not advisable to significantly raise stakes unless if you're adopting a trading strategy of some sort. So yeah, I hope some of these hints and tips will give you some guidance and give you some area to look into and a little bit more depth, or to deploy against a strategy that you have in mind. And I really hope that you have a successful World Cup.